They didn't scream when the ropes tightened. The crowd of witnesses stood silent as one by one, the female SS guards dropped, necks snapping under the weight of justice. These weren't fragile women. They were executioners, torturers, and tormentors inside Gross-Rosen, one of Nazi Germany's most brutal concentration camps. Behind the gates of that camp, women didn't just follow orders. They designed suffering. They starved prisoners, beat them to death, watched as corpses piled up like refuse. Dressed in ironed uniforms and leather boots, they walked the blood-stained grounds, not as victims of war, but as willing instruments of genocide. This isn't another tale of war's chaos. It's a revelation of how women too became monsters, and when the world saw what they had done, it did not forgive. This is the story of Gross-Rosen's female SS guards and the moment they faced the noose. Gross-Rosen began as a subcamp of Sachsenhausen in 1940, but by 1941, it had grown into a sprawling concentration camp network located near the town of Rogoznica in Lower Silesia, then part of Nazi Germany. At its peak, it managed over 100 subcamps, many of which were tied to brutal forced labor operations, including stone quarrying, armament production, and infrastructure work. Prisoners worked to death, often with no food, medical care, or shelter from the elements. Initially, Gross-Rosen held Polish political prisoners, but its inmate population quickly expanded to include Jews, Soviet POWs, and people from nearly every Nazi-occupied country. Estimates suggest that over 125,000 people passed through Gross-Rosen's main camp and its satellite locations. Tens of thousands never left alive. As the Soviet army advanced in 1945, the SS began evacuating the camp. Thousands of prisoners died on death marches through the freezing landscape, shot or left to perish. The camp was liberated soon after, but the evidence it left behind painted a picture of unrelenting cruelty, systematic murder, and administrative efficiency in genocide. Gross-Rosen was a factory of suffering and a stage on which some of the most brutal female perpetrators in history played their part. When most people think of Nazi brutality, they imagine men barking orders, wielding rifles, and carrying out executions. But within Hitler's concentration camp system, women played an essential and often vicious role. These women were known as Aufseherinnen, or female overseers, and their presence in camps like Gross-Rosen was anything but symbolic. Recruited through job ads, Nazi women volunteered for positions in the SS Auxiliary Corps. Many were promised stable work, good pay, and national pride. What they delivered instead was terror. These women received weapons training, discipline instruction, and were authorized to inflict punishment, including beatings, forced labor, and selections for the gas chambers. Female guards often oversaw women's subcamps, but their authority extended far beyond daily routines. Witness testimonies describe sadistic behavior, guards encouraging dogs to maul prisoners, whipping women to death, or laughing as inmates froze outside overnight. They weren't coerced. They weren't helpless. They chose cruelty. The myth that women were passive bystanders in Nazi Germany has long been shattered. These women were not only present, they were active participants in a system designed to annihilate. And as Gross-Rosen's horror unfolded, some of the worst abuses were carried out not by men, but by these cold-faced women in SS Gray. Gross-Rosen's main camp was primarily male, but its vast network of subcamps held thousands of female prisoners. And where there were women inmates, there were often female SS guards overseeing them. Some of these women became infamous. Others slipped into obscurity, their crimes buried under decades of silence. But the legacy of their brutality remains. Jane Bernigau, one of the highest-ranking female guards in the SS, served as Oberaufseherin, chief overseer, for several camps, including Gross-Rosen's women's subcamps. She was responsible for training new guards and maintaining discipline. Though records are scarce on her direct actions, survivors described a regime of relentless beatings, starvation, and psychological torment. Bernigau was never convicted. She lived out her life in post-war Germany, dying in 1992. Irene Hashka arrived at Gross-Rosen in 1944 before being transferred to other camps. Captured after the war, she was tried and sentenced to prison for her role in prisoner abuse. Eyewitnesses claimed she took part in lethal punishments and torture sessions. Released early, she lived in relative anonymity. Then there's the case of Hilda Michnia, linked to the forced evacuation of prisoners from Gross-Rosen. Survivors testified that Michnia beat women too weak to walk, some of whom later died. Though investigated in old age, she was never prosecuted due to her age and lack of sufficient evidence. These women weren't anomalies. They were part of a structured, sanctioned system of violence. And yet, despite the overwhelming horror they inflicted, many slipped through the cracks of justice. The female SS guards of Gross-Rosen weren't bystanders. They weren't duped. They were architects of suffering, and for a few, justice eventually caught up. For others, history still waits to pass judgment. At Gross-Rosen, death wasn't always systematic. Sometimes it was personal, delivered with fists, whips, boots, and bullets. Executions happened openly. Torture was routine. The camp's cruelty was so pervasive that even hardened SS officers from other camps found it excessive. Mass executions took many forms. Some were methodical, shootings of Soviet POWs, gas chamber selections for Jewish prisoners, hangings staged as public warnings. Others were spontaneous acts of sadism, guards beating prisoners to death for collapsing during roll call or ordering prisoners into the freezing cold without clothing, knowing they would die overnight. In many women's subcamps, female guards wielded their authority with lethal intent. Witnesses spoke of women dragged by their hair, bodies dumped like trash, and guards laughing as inmates screamed. Some guards ordered prisoners to dig their own graves. Others shot those who slowed down during forced labor. Survivor testimonies offer harrowing glimpses. One woman recalled how a female guard forced her to watch the execution of her friend, then ordered her to clean the blood with her own clothing. Another prisoner testified to being beaten unconscious after asking for water. Few records survive of who gave the orders or pulled the trigger, but those who lived through Gross-Rosen remember the faces. And some of those faces wore makeup, manicured nails, and SS uniforms tailored for women. Mass execution at Gross-Rosen wasn't hidden. It was part of daily life, and some of the hands, soaked in blood, belonged to women whose cruelty rivaled any man's. When the Allies liberated Gross-Rosen and its subcamps, they found skeletal survivors, mass graves, and records that hinted at systematic slaughter. But finding justice, especially for the crimes committed by female SS guards, was another battle entirely. Unlike the highly publicized Nuremberg trials for top Nazi officials, most female guards faced justice in smaller, localized proceedings. Some were tried in the Ravensbrück and Auschwitz trials, where female SS personnel were held accountable for unspeakable acts. However, Gross-Rosen lacked a dedicated post-war tribunal, and many guards escaped prosecution altogether. Irene Hashka, as previously noted, was convicted and imprisoned, but served only a few years. Hilda Michnia was investigated decades later, in her 90s, but never faced trial due to age and health concerns. Jane Bernigau, despite her senior SS position, was never charged. She blended back into post-war society with chilling ease. In the chaos following Germany's collapse, records were destroyed, witnesses scattered, and priorities shifted toward rebuilding. As a result, many women who facilitated torture and execution at Gross-Rosen simply vanished into civilian life. Others lied, reinvented themselves, or were overlooked due to their gender. It wasn't just a legal failure, it was a moral one, and it left survivors with a bitter truth. Justice was selective, and for many female perpetrators, accountability never came. To this day, Gross-Rosen remains a symbol not only of horror, but of how easily justice can slip through history's fingers when the world is too eager to forget. Why does this story still shock us? Because it tears apart one of society's most deeply rooted illusions, that women by nature, are nurturing, incapable of true evil. The female SS guards of Gross-Rosen didn't just defy that stereotype, they demolished it. To face justice wasn't just about legal accountability. It was about confronting the uncomfortable truth that cruelty knows no gender. These women chose to serve death, and when exposed, the world hesitated to believe it. Some excused them, others looked away. And why not for the weak? Because this history demands we stare into a mirror most can't bear to look at. It requires us to shed comforting myths and acknowledge that evil often hides behind familiar faces, smiling, soft-spoken, maternal. The story of Gross-Rosen's female guards is more than a historical account. It's a warning. When ideology infects morality, anyone, man or woman, can become a monster. Why does this story still shock us? Because it rips apart a deeply embedded illusion that women are inherently less capable of cruelty than men. At Gross-Rosen, female SS guards didn't just break that myth, they buried it under corpses. To face justice was never just about trials. It meant exposing the full, horrific truth that these women chose violence, wielded power with sadism, and embraced the ideology of extermination. And yet, when their crimes came to light, the world hesitated, unwilling to believe women could be so monstrous. This isn't history for the weak of heart. It forces us to abandon the comfort of stereotypes and confront the universal capacity for evil. These women smiled as they beat prisoners. They signed off on death like it was routine. So the question lingers long after the executions. If ordinary women could become architects of hell, what are we all truly capable of?